In 1979, a young traffic cop named Sarah Patterson went missing while on her normal patrol. For 15 long years there was no sign of her. Then in the fall of 1994, the water level in the Clearwater River dropped lower than anyone had seen in decades. The river revealed something that had been hidden deep below its muddy bed. A fisherman named Jake Morrison was out near the steel bridge that connected the towns of Millbrook and Riverside. He had been fishing these waters for 30 years. That day he noticed a strange shine under the surface. At first he thought it was just leftover junk from construction nearby. But when he looked closer, his heart began to pound. He saw black and white paint faint under the algae. It was a police car. Not just any police car, but one from the late 70s. The news spread quickly. At Patterson and Associates law firm, a phone rang. Michael Patterson answered. Detective Linda Torres of the Millbrook Police was on the other end. Her voice was steady but carried heavy weight. She told him they had found something in the river that might be tied to Sarah's case. Hearing his sister's name after 15 years stunned him. Sarah Patterson had disappeared in October 1979 during her shift. She had been 26 years old and was planning to marry her boyfriend, David Chun, in the spring. The investigation, all those years ago, had turned cold within months. There were no answers, only painful silence. When Michael asked what they had found, Detective Torres said it was a patrol car under the river. The vehicle number matched Sarah's unit. Michael shut his eyes, feeling both fear and hope. Since the day Sarah went missing, he had dedicated his life to helping families of missing people. He had even left his prosecutor job to open his own practice. Every case he worked on had been an attempt to one day solve Sarah's mystery. When Michael reached the river, the scene was surrounded by yellow tape. The recovery team worked under the autumn sun to pull the car up from the water. Detective Torres met him there. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes and streaks of gray hair. She explained that the car showed long damage from being underwater, but some details did not match the original story. Michael asked what theory she meant, though he already knew. Years ago, Captain Robert Hayes had ruled that Sarah must have had a breakdown and chosen to vanish. He never believed it. Hayes had been the one to lead the case, but he cared more about closing it than searching for the truth. He retired 5 years earlier with honors, though Michael never forgave his careless work. Michael told Detective Torres firmly that he needed to know every detail they uncovered. Sarah had been dedicated to her job and to her life. She would never have walked away. Soon the car was lifted onto a flatbed truck. Michael got his first real look at it. It was a 1978 Plymouth Fury, still bearing the Millbrook police symbol, though coated in grime. One thing stood out. The driver's side door was crushed inward as if hit with powerful force. This was no accident. Torres agreed and said the car would be tested by forensics. If anything survived after 15 years under the river, they would find it. That night Michael sat in his study with piles of papers. He had saved every police report, every news article, every interview from the past 15 years. He had never let go. Sarah had worked Highway 9 on the night she vanished. The road ran close to the Clearwater River. Her last radio call had been at 9:47 p.m. She had reported a routine traffic stop at mile marker 23. After that her radio went silent. She missed her 10:30 check-in. Dispatch tried again and again, but she never answered. By midnight search teams had begun. They found nothing. The official report said her car was missing and Sarah was likely under stress and chose to leave. Michael always knew this was false. The department had stopped looking soon after. Now 15 years later the car had returned, but Sarah had not. If the car had been hidden in the river all this time, then where was she? And how had the car gotten there 2 miles away from her last call? Michael picked up the phone. He dialed David Chun, the man Sarah had been engaged to. David lived in California, now working as an engineer. When he answered, he was shocked to hear from Michael. Michael told him the patrol car had been found in the river. David was silent for a long time, then finally spoke. His voice shook. He asked if there was any chance Sarah might still be alive. Michael admitted he did not know. But he swore he would find the truth no matter what. When the call ended, Michael made a choice. He would not just sit and wait. He would run his own investigation at the same time as the police. He had 15 years of legal skills. He had contacts in law enforcement. And he had something no one else had. He had a brother's determination. He thought back to that October night in 1979. Sarah had been strong and steady. She had her future planned. She loved her job. She loved David. She would never have walked away. The dent in that car proved foul play. Someone had forced her off the road and into the river. Michael was sure of it. The case was no longer just a cold memory. The river had given up one piece of the puzzle. Michael was ready to find the rest. He would not rest until he discovered who had taken Sarah's life away and why. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be lies to cut through and secrets buried deep. But Michael had already lived with unanswered questions for 15 years. Now at last he had a lead. And he would follow it wherever it took him. Michael Patterson was not the kind of man to accept easy answers. For 15 years he had lived with the empty space his sister's disappearance had left behind. The discovery of her patrol car deep under the river was only the beginning. To him it meant that someone still carried the truth of what happened that night in 1979. He believed someone in Millbrook knew the secret and he was determined to uncover it. Detective Linda Torres had been part of the Millbrook Police Department for 12 years. She had handled robberies, violent crimes, and missing people before, but when she opened the case file for Sarah Patterson she knew it was different. It was not just an old file. It was a file full of mistakes. Sarah's disappearance had been classified as a missing person case. Reading through the reports, Torres saw things that bothered her. There were missing interviews, steps skipped, evidence mishandled, and even items ignored completely. Then came the new forensic findings from the car. The vehicle did not look like it had simply been driven into the river. The dents and marks suggested a violent impact. Worse still, blood had been found inside. The water had washed away much over 15 years, but the stains were still there. Michael sat across from Torres in the same conference room where, so long ago, he had begged Captain Hayes to do more. He remembered the walls, the table, the look on Hayes's face as he brushed him off. Now he sat in that same place with someone who actually seemed to care. Torres was calm but sharp as she spoke. She explained that the investigation 15 years earlier had failed badly. She laid the file open and showed him the details. Sarah's last call on the radio had been at 9:47 p.m. She had said she was conducting a routine traffic stop near mile marker 23 on Highway 9. Yet the reports showed no record of what car she stopped, no description of the driver, no ticket given out, no follow-up of any kind. It was as if the moment had never happened. Michael felt anger building in his chest. He remembered Hayes saying there was no evidence of foul play. But now it was clear that no one had even bothered to look. Torres told him there was more. She had gone over the duty schedules from that time. Sarah had been set to work the day shift on October 15th. Only hours before she started, her assignment was changed to night patrol along Highway 9. That was the detail that stopped Michael cold. He asked who had made that change. Torres answered with a name he knew too well. Captain Robert Hayes. The name hung in the air. Michael had always suspected Hayes was hiding something. Back then Hayes was respected and untouchable. But Michael had never trusted him. Torres said she wanted to speak to Hayes but not yet. She wanted more information first. Michael leaned forward across the table. He explained that he had spent half his life collecting files, names, interviews, and facts about Sarah. He wanted to work with her. Torres reminded him that he was no longer law enforcement and that his personal ties could complicate matters. Michael answered that his ties could also help. He had knowledge and resources no one else had. After thinking for a moment, Torres agreed. Unofficially she would share information, but it had to be handled correctly. If they were going to expose what happened to Sarah, it needed to stand up in court. Their first joint step was to visit the evidence storage facility. There, locked away for 15 years, were Sarah's belongings from the night she disappeared. The dust was thick. The boxes had not been touched since the case was frozen. Inside were her logbook, her citation book, and her duty belt. These items should have been in the patrol car with her, but instead they had been found in her locker. That meant she had returned to the station sometime during her shift. No one had ever written that in the reports. Torres studied the timeline again. If Sarah came back to the station, why, and when? The discovery shifted everything. Michael opened the logbook. He looked at his sister's neat handwriting for the first time in years. Most entries were normal patrol notes until the very last one. On October 15th, she had written about her shift being changed. Then she wrote that HC wanted to meet her after her shift. She added a final note. Something does not feel right. She ended it with the letter H. Michael's pulse raced. He said Hayes's initials were RH, not HC. Torres looked closer. HC could mean Harold Crawford. He had been a sergeant who worked closely with Hayes in 1979. Crawford had died in a car accident only 5 years after Sarah vanished. This note suggested something Michael had feared. Sarah had felt uneasy that night. She had been told to meet with Crawford. If she was worried enough to write it down, she knew there was danger. The next step took Michael and Torres to visit some of Sarah's old colleagues. Many were retired, but some were still around. Officer Patricia Murphy welcomed them into her kitchen. She had been Sarah's closest friend on the force. Over steaming coffee she told them Sarah had seemed nervous in the weeks before she vanished. She had mentioned seeing something she was not supposed to see. Torres asked what that something was. Murphy said Sarah thought there might be corruption inside the department. Officers were taking money, looking the other way, protecting things they should not. Sarah was strict about her duty. It troubled her deeply. Michael felt his mind pulling the pieces together. He asked if Sarah had named anyone. Murphy said no, but she had noticed that some senior officers lived far beyond their pay. Fancy cars, luxury watches, things that did not match a police income. Torres asked directly if Hayes was one of those men. Murphy hesitated. She would not make clear accusations, but she admitted Hayes always seemed to have money. He was controlling about which cases were investigated. He protected some people while shutting down others. As Michael and Torres left Murphy's house, the weight of what they were learning pressed down on them. This was no longer a case of a missing officer. It was something bigger. If Sarah had uncovered corruption and was ready to expose it, then someone had a reason to silence her. Torres warned Michael they had to be careful. If corruption existed in 1979, some of those people could still be around. They could still be powerful. That night Michael sat at home reviewing the day when his phone rang. He picked it up and heard a slow, cautious voice. The caller said his name was Frank Novak. Michael Patterson had lived half his life waiting for the truth. Now pieces were finally coming together. When Frank Novak called him, it felt like the case was moving in a new direction. Novak had been a mechanic at the police department garage in 1979. He was one of the last people to see Sarah alive. They met at a diner just outside of town. The booths were worn and the smell of old coffee hung in the air. Novak leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. He explained that on the night of October 15th Sarah came to the garage at about 8:30. She told him she needed to check something on her patrol car. Novak said she looked nervous and kept glancing behind her as if she thought someone was following her. Michael asked what she wanted to check. Novak said she asked questions about the radio system. She wanted to know if patrol conversations could be recorded or monitored. Novak told her that officially the answer was no. But he admitted there were ways for people to listen in if they wanted to. That answer gave Sarah's last radio call a new meaning. If she believed someone was listening, she might have been careful with her words. Torres asked Novak why he never told investigators back in 1979. Novak shifted uncomfortably. He said no one asked him and that after Sarah disappeared he was afraid. People whispered that asking too many questions could get you hurt. Driving back into Millbrook, Michael felt a mix of relief and dread. He finally had real answers after years of silence. But those answers pointed toward something worse than he imagined. It was not just a missing person case. It looked like a cover-up by people in power. Torres looked over at him and said tomorrow they would speak to Hayes. The next day they drove to Maple Street. Retired Captain Robert Hayes lived in a modest house with a new Cadillac in the driveway. The car seemed far too nice for a man living on a police pension. Michael and Torres sat for a moment in her unmarked car. Michael stared at the house of the man who had controlled his sister's investigation 15 years earlier. When Hayes opened the door, he still carried himself like a man used to command. He was 68 but tall and strong with sharp eyes. He greeted Torres by name and turned to Michael with a look of false sympathy. He said he had heard about the car and called it a terrible tragedy. His voice sounded rehearsed. Michael stayed silent while Torres spoke. She told Hayes that Sarah's case was being reopened and they had questions. Hayes invited them inside, but his politeness seemed strained. His living room was filled with police awards and framed photos. Michael noticed several group pictures from the late 70s. Hayes began talking about how sad Sarah's disappearance had been. He called her a good officer and said he regretted not giving the family closure. Torres opened her notes. She asked why Hayes had changed Sarah's schedule at the last minute from day shift to night patrol. Hayes's expression flickered. He said it was due to staffing issues and that Sarah was reliable. He claimed it was just a routine decision. Michael spoke up and said the timing seemed unusual. Hayes gave him a long look and said police work required last-minute changes and there was nothing strange about it. Torres pressed on. She said they had proof Sarah returned to the station during her shift because her gear was found in her locker. Hayes said he did not remember seeing her after the shift briefing. Michael studied his face. Hayes was calm but his eyes were tense and his hands clenched too tightly. Torres then asked if Hayes knew about Sarah's concerns regarding corruption in the department. At this Hayes sat back and grew harder. He denied it strongly. He said he ran a clean department and if Sarah had concerns she should have come to him. Michael said maybe she tried. Hayes turned on him with sharp words and asked what he was implying. Michael answered that Sarah found something dangerous and it cost her life and that Hayes knew what it was. The room went still. Hayes's friendly mask cracked. He said the interview was over. He told them to speak to his lawyer if they had real accusations. Torres and Michael left. Back in the car, Torres admitted Hayes was hiding something. She wondered if it tied directly to Sarah or if he was covering for something else. Michael asked what came next. Torres said they needed to dig into the department records from 1979. Using his legal connections, Michael gained access to old court and financial documents. Together they studied the files in the courthouse archives. What they found was disturbing. Many drug and crime cases from the late 70s had been dropped or reduced despite strong evidence. Several of the officers connected to those cases had either left the department quickly or died under strange circumstances. One name stood out: Harold Crawford. He was the sergeant Sarah had written about in her logbook. He died in a single car accident on a straight road during clear weather. The official story never made sense. Torres said the pattern looked like a conspiracy. If Sarah had discovered corruption tied to drug money, that would explain why she was silenced. Michael agreed. In 1979, cocaine smuggling had exploded in that region. The profits were huge. Their research was interrupted when Torres received a call from the forensics lab. The report confirmed that the blood in Sarah's patrol car was human and matched her blood type. The lab also found gunshot residue inside. Michael felt his chest tighten. After years of hoping she might still be alive, the evidence now pointed directly to murder. Torres explained further. The dents on the car showed it had been pushed or forced into the river. That evening Michael sat late in his law office surrounded by files and notes. The building was quiet. Too quiet. Then he heard footsteps in the hall outside his door. The guard was not due for another hour. The steps stopped just outside his office. Michael reached into his drawer and wrapped his hand around the revolver he kept for safety. There was a soft knock on the door. Then a voice he did not know spoke through the wood. The voice was low and steady. It said, "Mr. Patterson, I have information about your sister." Michael froze. His grip tightened on the revolver. He called out, asking who it was. The voice answered. Someone who was there that night. Michael heard the voice through the door. Someone claimed to know about Sarah. Against his better judgment, he opened it. Standing in the hall was a man in his 60s, thin and pale, with the look of someone who had lived a hard life. His hands shook as if he was nervous. The man introduced himself as Eddie Kowalski. He said he had once worked dispatch at the police department and that he had been on duty the night Sarah disappeared. Michael let him inside, but kept his hand close to the revolver in his desk drawer. He asked why Eddie was coming forward after all these years. Eddie lowered himself into a chair and explained. He said he was dying of cancer and could not carry this secret to his grave. Michael asked what he knew. Eddie said Sarah had come back to the station that night around 9:15. She was upset and scared. She had asked to use a secure phone to call someone outside the department. That matched what they already knew about her personal things being left in her locker. Michael asked if Eddie had overheard her call. Eddie said he had caught part of it. Sarah was talking to someone about evidence. She said she had proof of something but needed help to figure out what to do. She mentioned names including Hayes and Crawford and one more he could not make out. Michael leaned forward and asked what happened after that. Eddie said Hayes came to the station and seemed surprised to see Sarah there. They went into his office and spoke privately for about 10 minutes. Then Sarah left to continue her patrol. That was the last time Eddie saw her alive. Michael pressed harder. Why had Eddie not spoken up during the original investigation? Eddie's hands shook again as he said that Hayes had been in charge of the investigation, and Crawford had warned him that forgetting what he saw would be the smart choice for his own safety. After Eddie left, Michael called Torres right away. They both knew they were closer to the truth, but also moving into dangerous ground. If Hayes and others had killed once to keep their secrets, they might do it again. Torres warned that if their investigation exposed the wrong people, they could be putting themselves at risk. Michael understood. Still, after 15 years of searching, he was finally getting answers. He would not turn back now. The next morning Torres arrived early at the Millbrook Police Department. Chief Patricia Wells was waiting in her office. Wells had been with the department only 3 years and had been brought in from outside to modernize the force. Her face was serious. Wells told Torres she had been getting troubling calls about the investigation into Sarah Patterson's disappearance. Torres asked what kind of calls. Wells said the kind that showed people were nervous about what the detectives might uncover. She asked Torres to tell her everything. For the next hour Torres explained what they had discovered so far. She told the chief about the evidence of murder, the corruption tied to Hayes and Crawford, and the signs that the department had been compromised in the late 70s. Wells listened without saying a word, her concern growing with each detail. At last she spoke. She said that if corruption had run that deep in the 70s and 80s, it could still tie into people in power now, not just in the police but in courts, city government, and maybe even the state level. Torres asked if she was being told to back off. Wells thought for a moment and then said no. She told Torres to be careful, document everything, and make sure the case was solid before moving forward. While Torres worked on her end, Michael did his own research. He dug into the financial history of officers from 1979. What he found was alarming. Several men had sudden wealth that made no sense for their pay. Hayes had bought his house on Maple Street in 1980, paying cash for a home worth 3 times his annual salary. Crawford had bought expensive cars and taken overseas vacations in the months before his death. Others had quit the department suddenly and moved far away. Michael reached out to Catherine Morrison, a retired FBI agent who had worked on organized crime cases in the region during that time. They met at her home. Morrison explained that the drug trade in those years was very advanced. Cocaine came from Miami through several interstate routes, including Highway 9 where Sarah had been working. The money was enormous, millions of dollars. She said the FBI had suspected local law enforcement was compromised, but they had never been able to prove it. She pulled out a thick folder and showed Michael old reports. Many times drug shipments seemed to know ahead of time when police were planning to intercept them. That meant someone inside was leaking information. Michael asked if his sister might have discovered the same thing. Morrison said it was very possible. A patrol officer on Highway 9 could notice repeating traffic patterns, the same vehicles, suspicious drivers, and even strange stops that were cut short. Sarah could have started piecing it together. Later that afternoon, Michael met with Torres again. They compared notes. The evidence was strong but mostly circumstantial. They needed something solid that could hold up in court. Torres said they had to find exactly what Sarah had uncovered back then. There had to be some specific evidence she found that triggered her investigation. Their break came from a woman named Maria Santos. She had worked as a civilian clerk at the police department in 1979. After hearing that the case was reopened, she contacted Torres. She said that before she retired last year she had discovered something while cleaning out old files. She had not known what to do with it, so she kept it. Maria handed over a manila envelope that had been hidden behind a filing cabinet. Inside were papers written in Sarah's handwriting. They contained lists of license plate numbers, times and dates, and notes about suspicious stops. Even more shocking, there were copies of incident reports that had never been filed officially. Torres and Michael spread the papers across the table. It became clear that Sarah had been building a case step by step. The plates she recorded matched vehicles that had been stopped many times but never ticketed. She had been documenting corruption carefully, preparing proof that someone inside the department was protecting drug traffickers. Now the picture was clearer. Sarah Patterson had discovered a trail of corruption, and before she could reveal it, she had been silenced. The reports told about traffic stops where police had seen large amounts of money and strange cargo but never checked them further. The strangest part was that the reports named certain officers who stopped other cops from searching cars or making arrests. The names showed up again and again. Robert Hayes, Harold Crawford, and 3 more officers who all left the force by 1985. Michael stared at the papers. His chest felt tight and his voice broke as he said these words. This is it. This is what got Sarah killed. In the pile of papers was also a letter Sarah had started writing but never finished. It began with the words "to whom it may concern." She wrote that she wanted to report serious misconduct in the Millbrook Police Department. She said that in the last several months she had watched and written down proof that officers were taking bribes to let drug traffickers use Highway 9. She wrote that the corruption involved high-ranking officers and even her own supervisor. The letter stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if she had been interrupted and never got the chance to finish it. Torres called the district attorney's office right away. District Attorney James Fletcher read the files carefully. He was an old prosecutor known for going after corruption. After looking at the papers, he leaned back in his chair. This could be the biggest corruption case this county has ever seen. But we need to move carefully. If word gets out too soon, the evidence could vanish and witnesses could be threatened or worse. Fletcher picked a special prosecutor to work with Torres. They started building warrants for the people who were still alive. Robert Hayes was the main target. But there were also 2 other names. Detective Raymond Polk, who now lived in Florida, and Sergeant Marcus Wright, who had left the force to work as a private security man. Fletcher warned them that the problem was time. The crimes had happened more than 15 years ago. For some of the corruption, the statute of limitations might make charges impossible unless they could prove a murder conspiracy. As the investigation grew, word began to spread through police circles. Torres started to hear quiet warnings from older cops. They said she was digging into old wounds that should be left alone. It was never said directly, but the message was clear. Stop before it goes too far. Michael, meanwhile, was facing worse threats. His office got phone calls where unknown voices told him to let sleeping dogs lie. His car tires were slashed 2 times in the same week. More than once he saw the same dark car following him when he drove at night. Torres told him this only meant one thing. They are getting desperate. Which means we are close to something they really want hidden. Then came the break they needed. Frank Martinez, a former drug dealer, agreed to meet with them. He had once been arrested by Sarah only 2 weeks before she vanished. Since then he had gone into witness protection for helping the feds in a major drug case. The meeting had to be arranged carefully. Martinez told them Sarah was not like the other cops. She could not be bribed. When she pulled you over, she did her job no matter who you knew or how much money you offered. Then he gave them something they had been waiting for. He said he had seen Sarah watching a drug transfer on Highway 9 on October 10, 1979. That was only 5 days before she disappeared. She was taking pictures. She saw the money moving hands. She saw which cops were getting paid. Martinez said she had real proof that could have destroyed the whole group. The net was closing in on Hayes and the others. But they did not know Hayes already had wind of the investigation and was making his own plan. At 3:07 in the morning, Michael was woken by the phone. He had been sleeping badly. On the line was Torres. Her voice was sharp and urgent. Michael, get dressed and meet me at the station. Right now. We have a problem. What problem? Michael asked. Someone broke into the evidence storage tonight. Sarah's documents are gone. Michael felt his stomach drop. After 15 long years of searching and only now finding answers, the key evidence had been stolen. He asked how they had gotten past security. Torres said they did not know yet, but whoever did it knew exactly what to take and where to look. It had to be an inside job. At the station, Michael saw Torres working with internal affairs investigators. They were checking the cameras and talking to staff. The break-in had been carried out by a professional. No alarms went off. There was no damage to the doors. And only Sarah's files had been taken. Chief Wells was angry beyond words. She said this means the case has been betrayed from the inside. Someone in the department has been feeding the suspects our moves. Torres agreed. We thought we had kept things tight, but not tight enough. The missing files were a huge setback. But it also told them they were hitting the right target. Hayes and the others were scared enough to break into a police station just to destroy the proof. Michael asked if any copies of the documents survived. Torres said some. She had taken photos of the most important pages before storing them. But the originals were gone and the photos might not be strong enough in court. Still, they decided to move ahead. They would face Hayes directly. Even if they did not have everything, they could still push him. A cornered man might make mistakes. They found Hayes in his favorite restaurant. He was eating lunch with 2 men Michael did not know. One was tall and thin and carried himself like an old soldier. The other was short, round, and dressed in expensive clothes with gold rings on his fingers. When Hayes saw them, his smile vanished. He whispered something to the 2 men, and they quickly left the table. Captain Hayes, Torres said as she and Michael stepped up. We need to talk. Hayes crossed his arms. I have nothing to say without my lawyer here. That is your right, Michael said, and sat across from him. But you might want to know that we have recovered Sarah's evidence. The files she made before her death. It was a bluff, but the effect was instant. Hayes's face lost color. His hand shook when he lifted his coffee. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, but his voice was weak. Torres leaned closer. We know about the drug money, Robert. We know about the protection payments. The fake traffic stops. The whole setup. We have witnesses. We have bank records. We have Sarah's notes. Hayes jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over. People in the restaurant turned to look. His voice rose as he shouted. You have nothing. Sarah Patterson was unstable. She could not handle police work. She killed herself. And now you are inventing a story to avoid facing the truth. Michael stared at him coldly. Then explain how her patrol car ended up in the river with bullet holes and her blood inside. For a brief moment Hayes looked like he was about to say something important. His lips parted. His eyes flickered with fear. But then he shut his mouth tight. Hayes threw money on the table and walked out. He said the conversation was over. He warned that any more harassment would be reported to his lawyer and the state police. Michael and Torres saw him leave the restaurant and join the two men who had been sitting with him earlier. The three talked quickly in the parking lot before driving off in separate cars. Torres watched them closely. Those men were not friends meeting for lunch. Hayes was not acting alone. The meeting with Hayes had an immediate effect. That night Michael got a phone call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was changed by a machine, but the words were clear. "Stop digging, or you will end up like your sister." Torres also got a warning. A note was placed on her car. The message said some secrets are worth killing for. Drop the case or pay the price. Instead of being scared off, they knew these threats meant they were close to uncovering the truth. But the danger around them had grown. Chief Wells gave Torres extra security and told Michael he should think about protection too. If the killers had murdered once, they could do it again. Later that night Michael was still in his office when glass shattered at the front of the building. He grabbed his gun and called 911 as he moved forward. The window had been smashed with a brick. Wrapped around it was a note in bold letters. Final warning. When police arrived, Michael had already made up his mind. Sitting back and waiting was no longer enough. If Hayes wanted a fight, then he was ready. The next morning Michael told Torres they needed to act. Hayes and his people were getting inside information from someone in the police department. They needed to control the flow and watch who reacted. Torres was not sure about the plan. She said giving out false information could hurt the real investigation. Michael reminded her that their real investigation had already been ruined. Their evidence was stolen. Hayes knew every move they made. The only option left was to change the game. So they created a trap. They would give different fake pieces of evidence to different people in the department. Then they would watch to see which detail made its way back to Hayes. Torres told Sergeant Williams that Sarah had a safety deposit box filled with documents. She told Detective Parker they had a new witness who could place Hayes at Sarah's murder scene. She told Clerk Janet Morrison they had traced Hayes's bank accounts and found big cash deposits. Then they waited. The answer came quickly. Hayes contacted his lawyer and asked about the legal value of evidence found in safety deposit boxes. That was the same story Torres had given to Sergeant Williams. The leak was exposed. Williams had been passing information to Hayes all along. That explained why Hayes always stayed ahead of them and why the stolen files had been taken so neatly. Williams had been trusted for over 20 years. He was the last person anyone would suspect. His betrayal was the missing piece. They needed to handle Williams carefully. They had to catch him giving Hayes information, or at least make him admit his role. Torres had him followed. Before long they found out Williams was meeting Hayes often at a small bar outside town. They met in secret and took precautions not to be seen together. Torres and Michael looked over the photos. They had proof. But they still had to figure out how to use it. Their chance came when Williams made a mistake. At their next staged meeting, Torres told him there would be a raid on Hayes's house the next morning. She gave him the time and the team names. That evening Michael noticed a dark car following him again. He had seen the same car many times. Instead of going home, he drove to a crowded shopping center and called Torres. He told her the leak had put them in real danger and told her to meet him at the safe house. He said it was time to end this. Michael drove through dark streets with his mind racing. It had been 15 years since Sarah's murder, and the case was now reaching its final stage. The safe house was an old apartment used by the district attorney for special operations. Torres had arranged to meet him there with Special Prosecutor Ellen Rodriguez and FBI Agent Morrison. The case had grown larger than one murder. It was now a criminal conspiracy with ties reaching beyond Hayes. Rodriguez laid out the evidence on the table. Hayes had been meeting many people. Morrison showed photos of at least 6 others connected to the drug operation. Some had been police. Others were part of the drug network. Michael recognized several faces from his sister's old notes. Torres reminded them these were the same people Sarah had been investigating. They were the ones who stood to lose the most if the truth came out. That made them the most dangerous. Rodriguez explained the next step. They would use Williams against Hayes. They would give him false information about a new witness who could prove Sarah was murdered. Then they would set up a fake meeting with this witness and watch to see who came to stop it. Morrison said if Hayes or his people took the bait, they could at least be charged with conspiracy. Michael was given the key role. He would play the false witness himself. He would use what he knew about Sarah and the case to sound convincing. Torres warned him it was dangerous. If Hayes believed he was a threat, they might kill him. Michael said they had already tried. At least this way he could control the situation. The plan was set for the following night at a warehouse near the edge of town. Michael would meet Torres there pretending to give his testimony. Hayes and his people would find out through Williams and come to stop it. While preparing for the sting, Torres learned from her contacts that Hayes had been making calls across state lines. He was trying to gather more help and organize a wider response. That made the plan even more urgent. If Hayes had time to bring in reinforcements, the case could collapse and more lives could be lost. The team gathered their notes and surveillance photos one last time. The danger was greater than ever, but they also knew this was the closest they had ever been to real justice. Sarah's killers had hidden in the shadows for 15 years. Now the trap was set, and soon the truth would be forced into the light. The next morning brought a twist no one had expected. Sergeant Williams walked up to Torres with what seemed like useful information about the case. He spoke in a careful voice. "Detective, I have been thinking about the Patterson investigation. Something came back to me that might be important." Torres kept her face calm and professional. She pressed record on her small device, making sure every word was captured. "What is it you remembered, Sergeant?" Williams rubbed his hands together before answering. "I was working the night Sarah went missing. I remember Captain Hayes leaving the station around 10:30 that night. It was strange because he usually worked days, not nights. He looked nervous, like something was bothering him. This could be valuable information. But Torres also knew it could be another trick. Williams might be trying to twist the story and cover Hayes again. She decided to test his loyalty. "That is useful, Sergeant. We have an interview tomorrow night with a witness. This person might confirm your story. The meeting is at 8 at the Morrison warehouse on Industrial Boulevard." Williams nodded quickly and jotted it down, exactly as Torres thought he would. "Do you want extra security for the interview?" he asked. Torres shook her head. "No. We need it quiet. Just Detective Parker and me." A few hours later, Torres watched Williams in the parking lot. He sat in his car making a phone call. She could not hear the words, but she did not need to. The trap was working. By evening, Michael felt a mix of excitement and fear. He had waited 15 years for this night. For so long he had wanted answers about Sarah. Tonight he would face the people who had stolen her life. The Morrison warehouse stood dark and empty. It had once been a factory, but now was nothing more than broken glass and shadows. It was a perfect place for surveillance. There were many entrances and exits. The FBI team arrived 2 hours early. They set up cameras, wires, and backup squads hidden in the darkness. Michael would enter at exactly 8 o'clock. Hayes and his men would have time to position themselves too. Agent Morrison spoke to Michael over the radio. "Your job is simple. Get them talking. Make them say enough for us to prove their part in the conspiracy. Remember, the wire you wear is recording everything. If Hayes admits to killing Sarah, we can finally get justice. Michael tapped the small device hidden in his jacket. He had a second recorder just in case. At 7:45, surveillance spotted several cars pulling up near the warehouse. Hayes was there. He was not alone. 4 other men walked with him. 2 carried guns that glinted under the dim streetlights. Morrison's voice came over the headset. "This is worse than we thought. They came ready for war." Michael walked toward the warehouse at exactly 8. His heart pounded, but he kept moving. After 15 years of nightmares and questions, he was about to face the truth. The building loomed over him, silent and cold. Inside, shadows shifted against the concrete walls. Hayes stepped forward from behind a pillar. 2 men flanked him, their faces hidden in the gloom. "Mr. Patterson," Hayes said. His voice echoed in the hollow space. "I hear you have something to say about your sister." "That's right," Michael answered. His thumb brushed against the panic button hidden in his pocket. "I know what happened to Sarah. And I know who is responsible." Hayes walked closer. Michael could see his face clearly now. The man looked desperate, like a cornered animal. "Then let us finally speak honestly about the past." Michael had imagined this moment since 1979. Every night he had replayed Sarah's last moments in his mind. Now, at last, he was staring at the man who had led the cover-up. The warehouse seemed like a cathedral of shadows. Hayes stood 20 feet away, still flanked by his guards. His voice was the same voice he had used as captain, commanding and heavy with authority. But now there was fear in it too. "You have been very persistent, Mr. Patterson. Some would say foolishly persistent." Michael kept his hand near the panic button but did not press it yet. He needed Hayes to keep speaking. The recording was the key. "My persistence is because my sister deserves justice. And because men like you believe a badge hides your crimes." Hayes gave a laugh, but there was no real humor. "Justice. Your sister was naive. She thought she could ruin the careers of good men with her childish morals. She did not understand that sometimes you must bend the rules to keep control." "Bend the rules?" Michael snapped. "You were taking money from drug dealers while wearing a police uniform." "We were keeping order," Hayes said sharply. "The drug trade was going to happen no matter what. At least with us involved it did not get completely out of control." Michael's anger boiled inside him. "And when Sarah threatened to show the truth, you killed her." Hayes lowered his voice. "Sarah forced our hand. She refused to listen. She had files, tapes, proof that could ruin dozens of officers. Families destroyed. Good men in prison." Through his earpiece Michael heard Morrison whisper, "Keep him talking. Ask about the murder." "How did you kill her?" Michael said. "How could you murder another officer?" Hayes froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Michael wondered if he had gone too far. Then Hayes began to speak, and the words spilled like a confession he had carried for 15 years. "We never planned to kill her. Not at first. Crawford and I just wanted to talk sense into her. To make her understand that she was playing with fire. But Sarah was stubborn. Always by the book. So you killed her for doing her job. We met her at mile marker 23 after her shift. Crawford was supposed to persuade her to burn the evidence. But she had a recorder hidden. Michael, she was taping us the whole time." Michael felt his chest tighten. Sarah had been even braver than he realized. When Crawford found the recorder, he panicked. They struggled. Hayes's voice cracked. The gun fired. It was not planned. But she was gone. And we had a tape of Crawford trying to bribe her. So you covered it up. We had no choice. That tape would have destroyed everything. Crawford's career. Mine. 8 more officers. So we staged it. We made it look like she drove into the river. But the current was stronger than we thought. The car sank into the mud and stayed there. Michael asked for more details. He wanted to know what happened to Sarah's body. Hayes shifted in his seat and looked uneasy. He said they could not leave her in the car because it was too risky. Instead, they buried her in the woods about 10 miles from town. The words struck Michael hard, almost like a physical hit. For 15 years he had wondered what had happened to his sister. Now he finally knew, but instead of peace, the truth gave him even more pain. Where exactly? Michael demanded. Hayes shook his head. His attitude suddenly shifted as he realized how much he had already revealed. It doesn't matter now, he said. What matters is making sure this talk never leaves the warehouse. Michael understood that Hayes would not let him walk away alive. He knew too much. His hand was near the panic button. He hesitated, because pressing it would bring the FBI in right away, and they would be walking into danger. You can't kill everyone who knows the truth, Michael argued as he slowly stepped backward toward the exit. Detective Torres knows. The FBI knows. Killing me won't fix anything. Hayes stared at him coldly. It will get rid of the most persistent problem, he replied. He gave a small signal to the two armed men beside him. Michael hit the panic button and dove behind a thick concrete pillar as the sound of gunfire exploded around him. Bullets hit the walls and metal beams, sparks flying in the dark warehouse. FBI. Drop your weapons. Agent Morrison's voice thundered through a megaphone. Tactical teams charged into the building from several entrances at once. The next few minutes were pure chaos. Gunfire cracked in all directions. Shouts and orders bounced off the walls. Hayes and his men tried to fight back, but they were caught in a crossfire. FBI agents quickly surrounded them. Michael crouched low behind the pillar, listening as the battle echoed through the huge, empty building. After what felt like forever, the gunfire stopped. Stay down until we give the all-clear, Agent Morrison said in Michael's earpiece. 10 long minutes passed before the agents declared the building secure. When Michael finally stood up, he saw Hayes slumped against a wall, wounded and handcuffed. One of Hayes's men was dead, and the other was badly hurt but still alive, getting treatment from medics. Did you get everything? Michael asked Morrison as paramedics checked him for injuries. Every word, Morrison confirmed. Hayes confessed to conspiracy, murder, and covering up the truth. We now have enough evidence to bring him and everyone else involved to trial. Detective Torres came to Michael's side. Relief and pride showed on her face. It's over, Michael, she said. After 15 years, we finally have the truth. Michael shook his head. Not yet, he said quietly. Hayes had told him where Sarah's body was buried. Until they found her, the fight was not truly over. He told me she's 10 miles from town, buried in the woods. Torres nodded firmly. We'll find her, she promised. We'll bring her home. As FBI agents loaded Hayes into an ambulance under heavy guard, Michael caught his eyes one last time. The arrogance Hayes once carried was gone. His authority was gone too. All that was left was a hollow man who had finally been exposed for his crimes. The conspiracy that took Sarah's life had been uncovered, but Michael knew the corruption would take months to fully untangle. At the FBI field office in Albany, Hayes sat in a plain, windowless interrogation room. The room had been designed to strip away distraction and force attention on the questions asked. Across from him sat Special Prosecutor Ellen Rodriguez and Agent Morrison. Hayes's lawyer was present, but he offered little defense. Hayes seemed to know that confession was his only option. Behind the one-way glass, Michael and Detective Torres watched. For the first time, the man who had hidden Sarah's murder for 15 years was about to tell everything. Let's start at the beginning, Rodriguez said. Her voice was calm, steady, professional. Tell us about the corruption in the Millbrook Police Department in 1979. Hayes looked tired, older than his 68 years. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his secrets. It started small, Hayes said. We were paid a few $100s to ignore certain vehicles that came through town. The drug dealers were going to use Highway 9 no matter what. At least this way, we had some control. Who made the first deal? Rodriguez asked. Harold Crawford, Hayes admitted. He had gambling debts. Needed money quick. He reached out to the traffickers and offered protection. Agent Morrison leaned forward. How many officers were part of this? Hayes sighed. 9, including me and Crawford. Patrol officers, detectives, even a dispatcher. Everyone had their role to make sure some cars weren't searched too closely. The numbers were shocking. Nearly a quarter of the department was involved, creating a criminal network that lasted for years. Tell us about Sarah Patterson's investigation, Rodriguez said next. Hayes's face darkened. Sarah was always by the book, always asking questions. In early October 1979, she started to notice odd patterns. Cars that were pulled over but never cited. Stops that were suddenly called off. It made her suspicious. What did she do with this suspicion? Rodriguez asked. She began investigating on her own, even when she was off duty. She took photos of meetings between us and the dealers. She wrote down license plates. She built a case with strong evidence. Michael felt pride rise in his chest. Even in danger, Sarah had stayed loyal to her oath. When did you realize she was investigating you? Rodriguez pressed. October 12, Hayes said. Crawford noticed she was asking for certain files. Files that had nothing to do with her patrol work. We saw she was close to exposing everything. What was your first plan? We tried to transfer her, Hayes admitted. Move her away from Highway 9. But she refused. She said she was working on an important case and would not leave it unfinished. So you decided to silence her? Rodriguez asked sharply. Not right away, Hayes insisted. We tried to reason with her. Crawford set up a meeting with her on October 15 after her shift. Rodriguez glanced at her notes. But you changed her schedule that day. Instead of a day shift, she was placed on Highway 9 that evening. Hayes nodded. We needed her in a certain place at a certain time. It had to look normal, not like a setup. The cold calculation behind it made Michael's stomach twist. His sister had been trapped from the beginning. Tell us about the meeting, Rodriguez demanded. Hayes took a deep breath, his eyes lowered. Crawford and I met her at mile marker 23 around 10:15 p.m. We tried to talk her out of it. We offered money, promised promotions if she would just forget. But she refused. She said she had taken an oath to uphold the law. She told us she had already written a full report and planned to give it to the state police the next morning. Rodriguez's tone sharpened. And what happened after that? Hayes fell silent, the memory heavy on his face. Michael watched from behind the glass, his fists clenched. The truth he had waited 15 years to hear was about to come out. Crawford lost control. He pulled out his gun and aimed it at Sarah. He told her to destroy her report, or he would make sure she never turned it in. But Sarah had been recording everything with a hidden tape recorder. She had captured the bribe attempt, Crawford's threats, and even their talk about covering up the corruption. When Crawford realized she had proof, he lunged at her to grab the recorder. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair as Hayes continued. That was when the shot was fired. Crawford and Sarah struggled for control of the gun. Sarah tried to run toward her patrol car while still holding on to the recorder. Crawford was desperate to take it from her. The weapon went off during the fight. Rodriguez asked if the shooting was accidental. Hayes paused before answering. Yes, the shot itself was not planned. But what happened afterward was no accident. He explained that Sarah was still alive after the shot. She was on the ground bleeding, begging them to call for help. At that moment, they had to make a choice. Michael clenched his fists as he watched through the glass. His sister had suffered and still asked for help, but they had turned their backs on her. Rodriguez asked, "What choice did you make?" Hayes said Crawford insisted Sarah could not live. She had the recording. She had proof of their crimes. She had just seen Crawford point his gun at her. Even if the shooting was not on purpose, they faced years in prison for bribery, assault, and conspiracy. Crawford argued it was the only way to protect everyone involved, the 8 officers, their families, and their careers. Rodriguez's voice stayed steady though Michael saw the anger in her face. So you decided to kill her? Hayes nodded. Crawford finished what the accidental shot started. Then they staged the scene to make it look like Sarah had driven into the river. They thought the current would carry her car away, making it look like suicide or an accident. But the water was shallow, and the car got stuck in the riverbed mud. Afraid it might be found, they left it and said Sarah had vanished. Rodriguez pressed on. What did you do with her body? Hayes looked at the one-way mirror, as if he knew Michael was there watching. We buried her in Millbrook State Forest, 10 miles north of town, near the old logging road. That is where we laid her to rest. His words were cold, almost clinical, but the meaning was horrifying. Sarah had been murdered by her own fellow officers, then buried in a secret grave while her family searched and grieved for 15 years. Rodriguez asked what happened to the tape. Hayes said Crawford destroyed it right after the shooting. It was the most damaging evidence they faced. Rodriguez asked if anyone else witnessed the murder. Hayes shook his head. Only he and Crawford were there. The others knew about the meeting, but they were not present when Sarah was killed. The confession ended. Hayes had given enough detail for murder charges against himself and conspiracy charges against the others. Michael stood silently, his emotions a storm inside him. He had answers now, but they gave no peace. They only confirmed his worst fears. Detective Torres touched his shoulder and told him they would find Sarah. Hayes had given them the location. Michael could not speak. His throat was tight. After so long, they were close to bringing his sister home, though the pain still felt as sharp as the day she vanished. The investigation that began with Sarah's patrol car in the river had now exposed a massive conspiracy. The corruption had claimed her life and spread across the police department. Justice was finally within reach, but the cost was unbearable. The search began 1 month later. It was a cold November morning when forensic teams entered Millbrook State Forest. Michael stood at the clearing's edge, watching them dig. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief forensic anthropologist, directed the excavation. Each bone and each item was carefully removed and documented. They were preserved not only for the court case but also to give the Patterson family long-awaited closure. Dr. Walsh explained that the soil and depth had preserved more of the remains than expected. Torres worked with the FBI agents, mapping the site and collecting anything that might help strengthen the charges. Hayes's confession had already led to the arrest of 5 more former officers, including Sergeant Williams, who had been secretly giving Hayes information. For 3 days, the team worked carefully. Finally, Dr. Walsh confirmed Sarah's identity with dental records and personal belongings. She had been wearing her engagement ring when buried. They also found her police badge and service weapon. The weapon raised new questions. Ballistic tests would determine if it matched Hayes's story about the struggle. It might give more proof of what happened the night she died. While the forensic teams uncovered Sarah, Prosecutor Rodriguez was building her case. Hayes's confession gave her a roadmap, but proving crimes meant pulling records, gathering testimony, and linking evidence. The corruption was deeper than expected. Bank records revealed that the 8 officers had received over $2 million in bribes between 1977 and 1985. They had bought houses, cars, and luxury items far beyond their salaries. Even worse, the investigation showed they had tampered with murder cases during those years. Killers had walked free because these officers took money or favors from criminals. One of the arrested men, Detective Marcus Wright, agreed to testify for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed more than Hayes had shared. The drug operation was massive, with roots across the Northeast. Millbrook was only one stop on a huge trafficking line worth hundreds of millions of dollars in cocaine. Wright's cooperation led to the arrests of civilians as well. Local businessmen who laundered money were taken in. Truck drivers and warehouse workers who moved the drugs were also caught. For Michael, the forest excavation was the most painful step. As the remains came out piece by piece, his heart broke again. But he also felt the truth was finally undeniable. The lies were ending. His sister had stood for justice. She had fought against a corrupted system. And though it had cost her life, the truth was now shining through. Dr. Walsh placed Sarah's engagement ring in Michael's hand once the recovery was complete. It was a small piece of her life, but it carried her memory. Torres stood beside him, telling him they would keep pushing until every last conspirator was held accountable. Michael nodded. The pain was heavy, but at least now, after 15 years, the silence was broken. The corruption had lasted for years, poisoning the department and protecting drug traffickers. But Sarah's determination, even in death, had finally forced the truth into the open. Her body was found. The conspiracy was exposed. And justice, though late, was finally on its way. The new stage of the investigation brought out another shocking truth. It showed that the death of Harold Crawford in 1984 might not have been an accident. Crawford had been drinking a lot during the years after Sarah's murder. His life was falling apart, and people close to him noticed that he was thinking about telling the truth to the authorities. Wright explained that Crawford was becoming unstable. He had started talking about clearing his conscience, about confessing to everything that happened to Officer Sarah Patterson. Some people in their circle were afraid that if he confessed, he would bring them all down with him. Crawford died in what was called a car accident. But the accident looked strange from the start. His car had crashed into a tree at very high speed on a straight road, in perfect weather, with no signs that he tried to stop or avoid the crash. Agent Morrison, who had been going over the case, studied the old investigation again. He noticed things that had been ignored back then. The brake lines of the car showed signs of being cut or tampered with. The officers who originally investigated the crash had overlooked that evidence, and Morrison suspected they might have been part of the same corrupt system that covered up Sarah's murder. Morrison told Michael that they were probably looking at another killing. Crawford may have been murdered so he could not confess. That meant Sarah's death had led to at least one more victim. The discovery that the conspiracy killed more than one person gave prosecutors a new urgency. Special Prosecutor Ellen Rodriguez filed new charges against Hayes and the other surviving officers. These charges included racketeering, which could put them in prison for life. The case was now bigger than anyone first imagined. Federal agencies and law enforcement groups from other states became interested. The drug network that had gone through Millbrook reached into New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. That meant other police officers from outside towns might also be involved. Michael Patterson, still grieving the loss of his sister, now found himself helping other families too. Parents and spouses who had lost loved ones in strange cases during the late 1970s and early 1980s began to contact him. They believed that what happened in Millbrook might connect to their own tragedies. Michael spoke to many families, but the most heartbreaking call came from Janet Morrison. Her husband, Detective Raymond Morrison, had died in 1983. Officials ruled his death a suicide. He was found in his car with a gunshot wound to the head. But Janet never believed it. She told Michael through tears that her husband had been investigating drug trafficking in the area. He had told her he was close to exposing something huge. He was excited and confident about making arrests. Then suddenly, he was dead, and all his files and notes were gone. Janet's story added to the growing pattern. The drug ring had not only bribed police but also removed any honest officer who came close to the truth. Sarah Patterson had been the first, but Detective Morrison and maybe others had been killed as well. While families were still coming forward, Dr. Jennifer Walsh finished her detailed forensic examination of Sarah's remains. Her report confirmed much of what Hayes had said in his confession. Sarah had been shot twice. The first shot happened during the fight Hayes described. The second shot came after she was already down, wounded, and unable to defend herself. Dr. Walsh explained to Michael that the second shot was fired at very close range, directly into Sarah's chest. It was not an accident. It was meant to kill. The forensic proof supported charges of murder against both Hayes and Crawford. Crawford was dead, so he would never face a court. But the evidence also showed that the other officers who knew what happened and helped cover it up were guilty of conspiracy. As the 1-year mark since the discovery of Sarah's patrol car came closer, Michael thought about everything that had happened. From the day he stood by the Clearwater River to now, the investigation had pulled the lid off an entire system of corruption. Dozens of old cases would now have to be reviewed. Wrongful convictions might be overturned. Victims of the conspiracy would finally get their chance at justice. For Michael, the most important part was that his sister would finally be honored as the police officer she truly was. Sarah had died trying to uphold the law and defend her community. Now she would no longer be remembered as missing, but as a hero who stood against corruption. The courthouse in Albany was filled when the case finally went to trial. Reporters, law enforcement officers, and families of victims packed the room as Rodriguez gave her closing arguments. It had been almost 2 years since Sarah's patrol car was found. What began as a mystery about one missing officer had turned into one of the biggest police corruption cases in the state's history. Michael sat in the front row. After 15 painful years, he was finally watching justice move forward for his sister. Beside him sat David Chun, Sarah's former fiancé, who flew in from California for the trial. Detective Linda Torres, who had fought so hard to keep the investigation alive, sat nearby. Robert Hayes sat at the defendant's table. He was now 70 years old, frail, and a shadow of the respected captain he once was. He faced charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. Rodriguez looked directly at the jury as she began. She told them this case was about more than the murder of one officer. It was about a betrayal of the public's trust that had lasted years. Criminals had been allowed to work freely while honest officers were threatened, silenced, and sometimes killed. The prosecutors had built a powerful case. They showed financial records that proved unexplained income worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They brought in witnesses, including criminals who had turned against the group and officers who decided to cooperate. These witnesses explained the protection scheme that allowed drug dealers to operate safely along Highway 9. The strongest piece of evidence was Hayes's own recorded confession, played in his voice for the jury. The defense tried to argue that Hayes had been forced into confessing. They also said the events had happened too long ago to prove clearly. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Sarah's remains had been found exactly where Hayes said they would be. The forensic reports matched his story of her murder. Detective Marcus Wright, testifying in return for a reduced sentence, gave the jury a close look inside the conspiracy. He admitted how the officers convinced themselves they were managing a problem too big to fight. But in truth, they had become greedy. They took bribes from drug dealers. When Sarah threatened to expose them, they chose to save themselves and let her die. Wright spoke with regret. He told the jury that Sarah had been everything a police officer should be: honest, brave, and committed. She died because she would not compromise. They killed her because they had already compromised themselves. The trial lasted 6 weeks. More than 40 witnesses spoke, and hundreds of pieces of evidence were presented. The jury spent 3 days in deliberation. Then they returned with guilty verdicts on every charge against Hayes and 5 other officers. Hayes was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for the murder of Sarah Patterson. On top of that, he received more sentences for conspiracy and racketeering. The system that had silenced Sarah was finally broken. But the cost of justice was written in the lives of those who had been lost.